Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into something that really works behind the scenes, but, well, it hugely shapes our economies, even politics.
That's right.
We're talking about unearned income, specifically through the shareholding system.
Mm.
Think of this as getting a handle on a really key power dynamic today.
And you've brought us a really interesting piece from Mark at Knowledge is King, KIK.
Yes.
And our mission really is to dig into his perspective on this.
So what can listeners expect?
We'll be looking at how the system, potentially concentrates wealth and power, how that affects what corporations decide to do, and then the knock-on effects into the political sphere. We want to keep it clear, avoid getting bogged down.
Right, just the core ideas.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And just quickly, the shareholding system, fundamentally, it's how company ownership is sliced up into shares, letting people or groups own a piece.
Okay, let's start right there. Unearned income. It's a term that, well, it makes you stop and think a bit.
It does.
In this context, owning shares, what does Mark mean by unearned?
So, very simply put, it's income you get not because you worked for it directly, like a salary,
Right, not labor.
not from providing a service. It's income from capital you've invested. And Mark specifically zeroes in on income from owning company shares.
Okay, so dividends maybe, or are the shares just going up in value?
Precisely. Dividends paid out or capital gains when the share price increases. It's your assets working for you rather than you, actively working.
Got it. So money coming in just from ownership, basically, separate from a job.
That's the idea.
Now, Mark quickly links this ownership to economic control. How does that connection work?
Well, this is where it gets really crucial. Owning shares often comes with voting rights in the company.
Okay.
So the more shares you own, generally, the more votes you have. And more votes mean more say in, well, everything. Big decisions, company strategy, operations.
So it's not just a piece of paper, it's actual influence.
Exactly. Real influence.
And this is where it could get tricky, right? If, say, only a few people or funds own massive chunks of shares, does that mean their interests might start to dominate? Maybe even over. Like, what's good for everyone else?
That's a really key point Mark raises. His analysis suggests that, yes, that concentration of control can lead to decisions that mainly benefit those large shareholders financially.
How so?
Well, think about focusing heavily on short-term profit bumps, maybe even if it means cutting corners on long-term stuff like environmental impact or maybe even employee well-being.
Right.
It can create this sort of loop where having capital lets you buy more shares, which gives you more control, which helps you generate more capital.
It sounds like a potential driver of inequality then.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
If you already have money, you can buy more shares, get more influence, generate more unearned income.
And the gap widens. A sort of wealth flywheel, as you said.
That's a good way to put it. Mark's analysis points to how the system, as it often works now, can kind of exacerbate those economic divides.
Yeah.
Those with the resources acquire more ownership, which solidifies their control over economic activity, concentrating more wealth at the top. It's quite a cycle.
And Mark looks at some potential downsides of this shareholder-first mentality he describes.
He does.
He talks about companies maybe prioritizing profit above, well, other things. What might that actually look like on the ground?
Well, Mark's analysis suggests this intense focus on maximizing shareholder value. It can sometimes push companies towards practices that might be, let's say, ethically questionable or not great for society.
Like what, for instance?
Things like maybe holding down wages or cutting benefits to boost profits, or maybe ignoring environmental damage because fixing it costs money and hits the bottom line.
Right. Things that might look good on a quarterly report.
Exactly. Good for shareholders in the short term, maybe, but potentially bad for workers or the local community or the planet.
You see headlines about this sometimes, don't you? Companies getting fined for pollution or facing strikes over pay.
You do. And Mark's perspective helps understand the underlying system incentives that might be driving some of that behavior.
Okay, so we've got the economic influence inside the company. But Mark also talks about political influence. How does that work?
Yeah, this is the next layer. How does that economic power translate outside the company into politics? Well, a big part of it is resources. Companies, especially those with significant backing from large shareholders, often have a lot of money
Right.
that they can use for things like lobbying, pouring money into trying to shape laws and regulations in their favor.
So trying to influence the rules of the game.
Pretty much. Mark gives the example, hypothetically, of an oil company lobbying hard for policies that help their profits, even if those policies aren't great for the environment.
It's like using financial muscle to get a direct line to policymakers.
It can certainly look that way.
And it's not just lobbying, is it? Mark mentions wealthy shareholders may be influencing politics in other ways.
That's another point, yes. Individuals or groups with big shareholdings can also use their wealth to support political campaigns.
Backing candidates who align with their interests.
Exactly. Supporting candidates whose proposed policies seem likely to benefit their economic objectives. This can potentially lead to political power getting concentrated alongside economic power.
So the policies that get enacted might increasingly favor those who already have wealth and influence.
That's the concern Mark raises, yeah.
He also brings up corporate takeovers and mergers. How does the shareholding system play into those?
Well, the very ability to buy up shares is what makes takeovers possible, right? You buy enough shares, you gain control.
Okay.
And often the drive behind a merger or acquisition is about consolidating market share, maybe finding efficiencies, things that are expected to boost shareholder value down the line.
But what are the potential downsides, Mark points out?
He notes that these big M&A deals can often lead to job losses, layoffs, as the new, bigger company streamlines.
Right, the dreaded synergies.
Exactly. And it can also mean less competition in the market. If fewer big players dominate, that might mean higher prices for consumers eventually.
So concentration of market power, too.
Yes, another form of concentration.
Now, there's one more angle here that Mark mentions, which feels quite serious. The idea that companies could try to suppress criticism.
Yes, this is about influence over information and public discourse.
How would that work?
The point Mark makes is that companies, particularly powerful ones with concentrated ownership, might use their financial clout, like threatening to pull advertising or investments from media outlets or platforms if they publish critical stories about the company.
So using financial leverage to discourage negative press?
Essentially, yes. It could create a kind of chilling effect, potentially limiting free speech and making it harder for the public to get the full picture about what companies are doing.
Wow. Okay, so it's a really interconnected picture of economic and political influence stemming from this shareholding system.
That's the argument Mark lays out.
But he doesn't just diagnose the problems, right? He also talks about potential solutions or ways forward.
He does offer some potential pathways based on his analysis.
What's the first one?
One major area is looking at stricter regulation of the shareholding system itself.
How so?
Things like perhaps policies that cap the maximum percentage of shares one person or entity can own in a company.
To prevent too much power ending up in too few hands.
That's the underlying idea, yeah. To try and diffuse that concentration of control we talked about.
Interesting. What else?
Another idea he floats is actively promoting employee ownership.
So workers owning shares in the company they work for.
Exactly. And not just owning, but also having more say in decision-making. Giving employees a stake, literally, could maybe lead to a better balance of interests being considered.
Beyond just the external shareholders.
Right, moving towards a model where more stakeholders have a voice.
Which seems to link to another point Mark makes about the responsibility of the companies themselves.
Absolutely. His analysis suggests shifting the focus. Companies shouldn't just be accountable to shareholders, but to a broader group.
Like who? Employees, communities?
Employees, customers, the communities they operate in, the environment, taking a wider view of their impact and responsibilities.
So embedding ethical practices, fair labor conditions, sustainability, making those core, not just optional extras.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Holding companies accountable on more fronts than just profit.
And Mark suggests it's not just up to regulators and companies. We have a role, too, as consumers.
That's right. He points to the power of consumer choice.
How so?
By consciously choosing to support businesses that act responsibly, that are ethical and sustainable.
Voting with our wallets, basically.
Kind of, yes. And also using our collective voice, things like boycotts or public campaigns to pressure companies that are seen to be causing harm.
So holding them accountable from the outside.
Exactly. Consumer action can be a really potent force for change.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've really dug into Mark's analysis here. It feels like the main takeaway is that this system, unearned income through shareholding, it's not just some dry financial mechanism.
Not at all.
It's actually a really powerful engine shaping our economic reality and our political landscape, too.
That's definitely the core message from Mark's piece, yes. It seems fundamental to modern finance, but it has these really far-reaching consequences.
For wealth distribution.
How companies behave.
And how political influence works.
Precisely. So understanding its potential downsides, according to this analysis, is pretty vital if you want to grasp the power structures around us.
So as a final thought for everyone listening, building on what we've discussed from Mark's work, what might a more equitable balance of power within that shareholding system actually look like?
That's a big question.
It is. Or maybe, if you could make just one regulatory change based on Mark's points, which one might have the biggest ripple effect for a more just or sustainable economy and political sphere? Something to chew on.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.